everyone, thank you so much for that warm welcome, and thank you for having me at this event. It's really an honor. I spent my day on Friday writing a letter to some senators about why they shouldn't increase penalties for drugs in response to the opioid crisis. So being here and hearing from the speakers earlier, and I expect to hear from some later, is really a cleansing experience compared to thinking about how to respond to people that think that the drug war should be further escalated beyond the level that it's at right now. My colleague Nicole Porter was originally planning to speak here today. She's our Director of Advocacy, and she couldn't make it, and so I'm here in her place. She would be able to move you with her words. I have to rely more on charts to do that, so bear with me. And having set the expectations very low now, let's get started. So the title of my talk is a title of a report that I wrote at the Sentencing Project, and it got developed during the time of the Black Lives Matter movement, and at the time I was thinking about how to organize ideas floating around about sources of racial disparity in the criminal justice system, and I wanted to encourage people that were interested in Black Lives Matter and policing issues to really think about these issues more broadly beyond the point of beyond contact with police officers, but also to consider what happens in terms of bail determinations, who goes to jail, who gets sentenced, what happens when you're released on parole or probation supervision. And so that's the purpose of my talk today. And I'm going to give you, so I work at the Sentencing Project. I don't know if you're familiar with the organization. We're based in DC. We've been around for over 30 years, and we do research and advocacy for a fair and effective criminal justice system. Fair, meaning we're trying to eliminate racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Effective, meaning that we're well past the point of using incarceration in any kind of useful and meaningful way, and so scaling back the number of people that are incarcerated. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of an overview of what things look like right now in terms of number of people that are incarcerated and who's sent there, and then try to present to you a framework for thinking about what the sources of disparity are within the criminal justice system, and present a couple of examples of reform efforts from around the country to tackle those sources of disparity. I've been thinking about this for a couple of years now, and I welcome feedback from you during this talk, and I'll ask you to participate with ideas of things that maybe I don't have incorporated in the talk, and so let's see how that goes. So this is a very well-known chart now showing the dramatic increase in the number of people incarcerated in the United States. This is only showing you the number of people that are imprisoned. So by 2015, the 2016 figure is slightly lower. It's about 1.5 million people in US prisons, another 700,000 in jail, so that's how you get to the 2.2 million number. What's notable here is you can see we haven't always had the problem of mass incarceration. We started to develop it in the 1970s as crime rates started to go up. Crime rates went up all around the world, across Europe and Canada. We are distinct in responding in this way and continuing to maintain such high levels of incarceration in response to that era of rising crime rates. And I should just add now, despite what President Trump and his administration suggests, we are at historically low rates of crime. Crime rates are unacceptably high still in certain communities and certain urban areas in particular. But we have about half the crime rate that we used to have in the 1990s when crime rates reached their peak levels. And yet we have not scaled back incarceration to reflect that. Okay, well, let me just go back. What proportion of people that are imprisoned in the United States would you guess are serving a time for, are there for a drug offense? So just throw out a number.
40.
Okay, good guesses. So I'm going to show you here. So this 1.5 million people that are imprisoned, about 200,000 people are in federal prison, and the rest are in state prisons. So 1.3 million in state prisons. I'm going to show you what proportion of people are serving time for a drug offense in federal prisons and what proportion are serving time for a drug offense in state prisons. And that's this next chart here. You might not be able to see it very well, but the drug row is the second one. In federal prisons, about half the people serving time are there for a drug offense. In state prisons, it's 16%. So it's a much smaller proportion than people generally think. And I think that's because a lot of the reform efforts really focus on drug offenses because that's sort of considered the lowest hanging fruit. Why are we sending people to prison because they have a substance use disorder, because they were selling drugs and so on? I do want to say that people are being sent to prison in part because they have a substance use disorder and they've committed crimes related to that problem, or they violated their probation and parole because they've been found to be in possession of drugs. And so the impact of the drug war is beyond who's convicted of a drug offense. But I just wanted to show you this to give you a sense that if we want to end the problem of mass incarceration, ending the drug war is not going to be enough. Half of the people that are serving time in state prisons are there for violent crimes. That's generally assault or robbery. And so if we want to scale back the number of people serving time in prison, we need to make sure to reduce prison sentences for those offenses as well. Here is, of course, what's notable about mass incarceration in the United States is not just the number of people that are serving time in prisons, but also the racial disparities and who gets sent away to prison. This is an analysis that estimates from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. They estimated what would be the lifetime likelihood of someone going to prison. And this is using the year 2000's rate of imprisonment and looking at how often people get sent to prison and get sent back. And what they found was that the lifetime likelihood of going to prison for a man in the United States is 1 in 9. 1 in 9 men in the United States will serve a prison sentence at some point in their lives, if recent trends continue. For African American men, it's 1 in 3 will at some point be imprisoned in their lives. And so that's a rate that's 6 times as high as for white men, and about twice as high as for Latino men. And so what's notable here is, this is not even, I'm not even talking about jail, I'm talking about prison, lifetime likelihood of serving a sentence of about 1 year or longer in a prison. So this is a remarkably high level of incarceration. For women, there are also major racial disparities in the lifetime likelihood of being in prison, but women are just far less likely to go to prison. So I want to ask you, from your sense of what are some of the factors that are driving this? Like in terms of like nuts and bolts specific policy decisions, specific discretionary choices, what do you think are some of the factors driving these racial disparities in incarceration?
Racist policing.
Racist policing, okay.
Mandatory fines.
Mandatory minimums, yep. And what else?
3 strikes.
3 strikes.
Easy to find.
What was that?
Easy to find.
Easy to find. Is that what you said? What do you mean easy to find?
Easy to find criminals.
Easy to find criminals. Okay. Yes.
Over surveillance in certain communities.
Yes. Over surveillance in certain communities. Other ideas? Yes.
Poverty.
Poverty.
Disparities in sentencing.
Disparities in sentencing. Yes. Oh, covered? Okay. Yes.
The opioid crisis is a crisis that we have to help white folk with, but the crack crisis, we just lock them up.
Right, great. And everyone hear that? Opioid crisis is a crisis that we respond to with a public health approach versus crack crisis we lock people up for.
Jury of peers is usually white peers.
Jury of peers are usually white, yes.
Lack of opportunities for felons.
Lack of opportunities for people with felony convictions, yes. Yes. Go ahead. Stop and frisk, great. Go ahead.
How we train lawyers and how we get judges.
How we train and get lawyers?
And judges.
And get judges, yes, thank you.
Profit motive for incarceration.
Profit motive for incarceration, great, thank you. I think I'm done. So I'm going to try to organize all of these suggestions into a framework that I think is useful for thinking about what are the sources of racial disparity. As I go through it with you, let me know if your suggestion, your thought doesn't fit into what I've described. And think about if you are familiar with reform efforts in the communities that you're from that address the driver that you just raised or that you heard from others. So there's a lot of question about how much of the racial disparity in imprisonment is driven by crime versus unwarranted bias in the criminal justice system. And by unwarranted, sometimes criminologists use these terms, warranted racial disparities versus unwarranted. The idea is that so-called warranted disparities are ones that stem from differences in criminal offending. So that would mean that the problem does not lie within the justice system, but at some point prior to the justice system. And then, so those would be the warranted disparities. And unwarranted disparities are when there is no difference in criminal offending, but somehow as more people coming into the justice system from one community versus other is what's driving the outcomes that we see. So my response to this debate is that both of these factors are relevant. So on the left, you can see homicide victimization rates by race. So what this chart shows is that victimization rates have declined over time, but it's much higher for African Americans than for whites. People generally commit homicide against others of the same race or ethnicity as them, and so that means that there is a higher level of homicide offending among African Americans than whites. If you completely change the landscape of our society and you put white Americans into concentrated urban poverty at disproportionate rates, these trends would be completely reversed. You would have a higher rate of homicide offending among whites than among African Americans. So that's what the most serious crime. You have racial disparities like that in criminal offending. Those kinds of disparities in behavior disappear as you go lower down into lower level offenses. The least significant kind of offense that I can present to you, I think, is marijuana possession. And on the right-hand side, this chart shows you differences in marijuana usage rates. So African Americans and whites use marijuana at almost identical rates. And yet, the African Americans are 3.7 times as likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. So these are two extremes that show you both factors where for drugs across the board, generally people use drugs at similar rates regardless of race or ethnicity. Research also suggests that people generally buy drugs from people of the same race and ethnicity as them. And yet we have far more people, about 2/3 of people that are serving time for a drug offense are there in prison are African American or Latino. So significant racial disparities, not because of differences in criminal offending, but because of differences in our criminal justice system. And so for many offenses, for many crimes that people are serving time for in prison, it's a little bit of both factors, depending on which kind of offense you're looking at. I'm going to focus the rest of the talk on the right-hand side of the equation, on the disparities that are created within the justice system. And I'll talk a little bit about disparities in criminal offending and what needs to happen to address that a little bit at the end. So this is the report where I outline what are the factors that are producing racial disparities within the criminal justice system. And so I'll go over each of them with you. The first one is racial bias in the use of discretion among judges, police officers, prosecutors, probation officers, the kinds of decision-making that they do when they can, when it's just up to them. There's not a policy necessarily guiding it, but it's up to their discretion. We'll talk about some examples. The second one is the disparate impact of evidently, purportedly race-neutral policies. And so the mandatory sentencing and so on, that's where that comes in. We'll talk about that. The third factor is policies and decisions that disadvantage low-income people because of the overlap between race and class in our society. To the extent that the criminal justice system is giving more favorable outcomes to wealthier people, that's making whites better off as they go through the system, if they go through the system. And then the last factor is policies that exacerbate socio-economic disparities, so that when people are done being punished within the criminal justice system, they're not done being punished by our society and by our economy. Okay, so here is the first factor. So bias in the use of discretion. In recent years, when surveys look at how often people are stopped by police officers, nationwide levels of police stops generally show relatively similar levels of stops. There are significant disparities in certain jurisdictions, but in the decision to stop, there's been a reduction in disparities when you look at national figures. What you still see is that police officers are more likely to pull over African American drivers for discretionary reasons. So when you look at when the officer checks off why they pulled someone over, a white driver is more likely to be pulled over for speeding. So speeding is something that, you know, if it's a less discretionary choice to pull someone over for speeding than for example, not signaling. More discretion involved in not signaling decisions. And so this is a study that was done by Charles Epp at University of Kansas and his colleagues, and made a distinction between investigatory stops and traffic safety stops. Traffic safety stops are you've run a red light, you're speeding, and so these are, you know, we want officers to be pulling people over for these reasons, is the idea. And investigatory stops are where police officers are quite upfront about it. They're pulling somebody over for a relatively minor violation, and police officers will tell you pretty much you can drive a block and they can find 5 reasons to pull you over if they really want to pull you over. And the purpose of the stop is to investigate. And so national data also shows that when police officers pull people over and they decide to search them, they're more likely to search black drivers than white drivers. And as a consequence of that, they are likely to have a much higher hit rate of drugs or weapons when they search white drivers, because they search white drivers who are much more likely to have contraband than black drivers. So that's one example of discretionary policing. So the Charles F. and colleagues study, what they found was that across the board, when you look at young people, old people, people driving expensive cars, people driving lower cost cars, African American drivers are more likely to be pulled over for discretionary, investigatory reasons than white drivers. So I think that often when people think about disparities in the criminal justice system, this is the kind of issue that they focus on, the use of discretion among police officers and among people working in the justice system. So there's also quite a lot of emphasis now on discretion of prosecutors, because that's very much a black box that gets very little documentation when they decide to charge someone with a mandatory minimum sentence, whether or not they decide to drop charges against them. So discretion really pops up when you look across the criminal justice system as an issue. And there have been efforts to address the discretionary bias of criminal justice practitioners. So, for example, there's implicit bias training now to get people that are working in the criminal justice system to realize that they're biased just like everybody else, and that their best bet is to at least just recognize that, monitor it in their decisions, and create some system of accountability. This is something that, for example, Milwaukee did when it came to drug paraphernalia charges. They found that prosecutors were bringing these charges much more often among African Americans than among whites, and both considering the population where both had drug paraphernalia on them, they would bring this extra charge against African Americans more than whites. And the prosecutor's office implemented a system so that prosecutors would be monitored in how often they're bringing these charges when they have the option to. They were able to significantly reduce the disparity in charging decisions on that particular offense. So the next factor is policies that have a disparate racial impact. And so these are, for example, I think the most famous example of this is the 100-to-1 crack cocaine sentencing disparity in federal law, which was reduced in 2010 to 18-to-1. But here is an illustration of how this looks when you look at drug-free school zones. So drug-free school zones, I think, make some intuitive sense. We don't want people selling drugs in a school zone, right? And so consequently, policymakers wrote legislation to increase penalties for people selling drugs in a school zone. School zones were defined relatively broadly. In many areas, they include community centers, daycare centers, and here's how it looks in Indianapolis, where school zones were defined to be 1,000 feet of these kinds of centers. What ends up happening is that many urban areas, much of the city becomes considered a school zone. And so if you're selling drugs not to students, with any intention of being near schools, you're going to be within a school zone and you're going to get a sentencing enhancement when you're caught. So what do we know about the landscape of urban areas versus suburban and rural areas? Well, if you use this kind of definition of a school zone within the suburbs or in rural areas, it's much easier to find yourself outside of a zone that has this kind of penalty enhancement. What do we know about who lives in urban areas versus who lives in suburban and rural areas? This policy ends up increasing penalties for people of color living in urban areas who are doing the exact same thing as their counterparts that are living in suburban and rural areas. So other similar policies to consider that are not about individual discretion, but that are about just across-the-board policies. Stop and frisk is one of them. Broken windows policing is one of them, where it's a departmental-wide policy shaping the decision of criminal justice practitioners. Oh, and another one that I should just mention is habitual offender laws, like 3 strikes laws. Given that people of color are much more likely to be pulled over, searched, picked up for minor things, get a record, when you have a law on the books that says third strike and you're out in whatever way, that's more likely to increase penalties for African Americans and Latinos compared to whites. And so again, here there have been efforts to reform these policies. So Indiana and Connecticut and New Jersey as well have reformed their drug-free school zones, so reduced the size of the zone. Some places have implemented a requirement that the person selling drugs should at least have a reasonable expectation that students are nearby. So if you're selling drugs in a school zone on a Saturday, it shouldn't have the same kind of penalty for you as if you're doing it at 1 o'clock on a Monday. New York City has ended its stop and frisk policy as a result of a lawsuit there, and they've also scaled back broken windows policing as a result of a lot of pressure following, I'm forgetting, remind me of the person who was killed in Staten Island, remember, for selling, Eric Garner, for selling cigarettes. So as a result of outcry over that case, there's been much more attention to, much more criticism of broken windows policing, though even there, the former police chief, William Bratton, who is really a strong proponent of this policy, has said, the research doesn't show that it's effective, but I know in my gut it is. And his replacement has continued to really support it, and the mayor has also been very reluctant to criticize this and take leadership in scaling it back. And then finally, a couple states, I've named them there, Iowa, Connecticut, Oregon, some other places as well, and New Jersey recently did this, have passed racial impact statement legislation, so that when a legislator passes a law, they have to explicitly consider if there's going to be a disparate impact on communities of color with these laws. So no more unintended, oh, this was an unintended consequence, we didn't see this coming. Take a look and try to, have a better assessment of what your policy is going to be before you put it on the books. Okay, the next factor is policies that disadvantage poor people. So this is Khalif Browder, who, picture of him, who was, you may be familiar with his case. So he was arrested in New York City for stealing someone's backpack. He refused to take a plea deal, claiming his innocence. Eventually the charges were dropped against him, but he was incarcerated in jail pre-trial for a very long time, really suffered from the interactions that he had, the violent interactions that he had in Rikers Island, and soon after his release he committed suicide. And so this illustrates the kind of problem that we have with pretrial detention. It illustrates many problems we have in the justice system, but one of the things I think that it illustrates is the problem that we have with pretrial detention, where people are held in jail if they cannot post bond. And there are many other policies that we have in place that similarly disadvantage low-income people and who are disproportionately low-income people of color. So that would include, for example, the quality of indigent defense, where in a number of states now, criminal defense attorneys are protesting the fact that they have such heavy caseloads that they cannot meaningfully represent the people that they're asked to represent. So on this issue as well, there have been some reforms around the country. So New Jersey, for example, reformed its bail system. This happened even under Chris Christie, a Republican governor. where now instead of just requiring people to post bond regardless of their risk, there is a risk assessment. Many more people are being released on their own recognizance, and so far there's a lot of resistance to these kinds of reforms from the bail industry, but so far they're no-brainer. But it's had really good results so far. What's really interesting is with a lot of the reforms I'm describing, a lot of people are some people express all this concern that crime is going to go up, we're going to lose control of our cities, and then the reforms happen and crime continues to decline, and leaving the question of why were we pursuing these policies in the interest of crime reduction in the first place? What was the basis? Another example that I have here is Berks County, Pennsylvania, made a major reform in its juvenile justice system so that if youth weren't able to present themselves as having a home, a safe home to return to as an alternative to their confinement, there would be shelters and public institutions in place for them to go to so that they wouldn't be held in confinement just because they don't have a home to return to. Okay, and then the last factor is punishing people after they're done being punished within the criminal justice system. And so the red bar that I have at the top there is just showing one of the boxes on a job application that asks for whether or not someone has a criminal conviction. Some job application forms ask for any kind of conviction, even arrests, some will inquire about. Thank you. When people are if people lie on these forms and the employer does a background check after, they'll be fired because they lied on their job application. If they truthfully report that they have a criminal background, the application, people describe just seeing the application tossed right in front of them. And so those are the options that many people face after they've gone through the justice system and are trying to find legal work to get back on their feet. When they're not able to do that, when they struggle with housing, they find restrictions in being able to access public housing. If they have a drug offense, they are then barred from public benefits depending on the state that they live, have struggle getting cash assistance and food stamps in particular for people who have a felony drug conviction. So these are the ways that we make it very hard for people to get back on their feet after they've gone through incarceration or community supervision. And again here, there are examples of well, I'll just go without the slides for now. So there are examples of reforms to address these problems as well, with a number of states implementing ban-the-box reforms. Generally, these policies affect only public sector hiring, so that if a city passes a ban-the-box reform, that means that the city will hire people, is willing to consider hiring people who have a criminal record. Ban-the-box reforms also, it's important to note, generally don't ban the box, they just delay the question so that the person can get a foot in the door, and after presenting, making their impression, then the employer does a criminal background check on them or asks them the question. Let's see. A number of states, so the federal government allows states to opt out of the welfare ban and cash assistance and food stamps ban, and a number of states are beginning to make that decision to opt out of those restrictions. And a number of there's a lot of organizing efforts around the country to push states in that direction to allow people to access those benefits. And then there are examples like in California, where in 2014, voters approved a referendum to reclassify a number of low-level offenses from potentially to be classified as felonies to misdemeanors, and also to reinvest the savings from reducing the number of people that would be incarcerated to drug treatment and drug prevention programs, crime prevention programs. Let me try one more time with this. Okay. Okay, so then on the other side, going back to the page that I showed you that had criminal offending as one factor and problems within the criminal justice system as the other. So now on this issue of how do we reduce the disparities in criminal offending for serious offenses, I had a quote that I was going to share with you that I'll read to you now. It's from Reverend Vivian Nixon, who is a very strong advocate on issues of getting people that are incarcerated access to higher education, behind bars and after. And I was at a conference where she spoke, and she made the statement that I thought really summed things up nicely. She said, the quality of the solution depends on who is impacted by the problem. Right? We see this to some extent with the opioid crisis. We see this with crime issues as well. If we had, if we had these problems of high levels of crime in white communities, how would we address that? How do white affluent neighborhoods achieve safety? They don't do it by bringing in a lot of police to screen everybody, right? That's not how it happens. When there are problems, there's not, when kids are generally not sent into the criminal justice system for getting correction and the kind of services that they need. Why don't we pursue those kinds of policies in low-income communities of color that are struggling with crime rates? Right now in nearby Maryland, the legislature is considering undoing some of the criminal justice reforms that they implemented in response to rising crime rates in Baltimore. Why is that the solution that's being pursued instead of investing in education, investing in job opportunities? And to answer the question, part of the explanation for that is that there's just much more willingness and this is something that I can sort of show you through research. The surveys have shown this pretty clearly. When white Americans are given survey questions and when they're asked, what proportion of crime do you think is committed by whites versus African Americans and Latinos, they overestimate how much crime is committed by African Americans and Latinos. The more they make that mistake, the more they overestimate it, the more supportive they are of punitive policies to address crime, rather than investing in prevention and rehabilitation. So race is a major factor in how we think about the problem and how people respond to the problem, the kinds of solutions that they come up with. So before I wrap up, I want to end on a slightly more positive note, which is that I showed you in the beginning the dramatic increase in the prison population. You might have missed it, but there's been a lot of progress in recent years. The prison population has been going down, so it's been down by 6% since 2009. That's after the prison population increased for every single year for 37 years. Every single year. So these are historic times where finally we're beginning to undo that dramatic escalation. Some states have really made dramatic progress. So states like California, New York, New Jersey have reduced their prison populations by over 25%. The juvenile justice system has reduced the number of kids in confinement by more than 50%. So there's really rays of hope to look for. But the thing is that one of the purposes of my talk and focusing on these issues of race is that we can't just have a universal goal of reducing mass incarceration. We have to make sure that that's coupled with the goal of reducing racial disparities. And the reason for that is that the two things, they don't go hand in hand. You have to make sure to be pursuing both goals if you want to achieve both. So in the juvenile justice system, for example, while the number of youth of color has dramatically declined, just like it has for white youth, it has done so less than it has for white youth. And so that's why we need to make sure that, so when you look at levels of racial disparity, they've actually increased for some communities of color, some youth of color. So fewer youth going into the system, but worse levels of racial disparity. And so we really have to make sure to prioritize ending mass incarceration and ending the racial disparities within the system. And I'll stop there. Thank you.